I don't think that Kristi Noem could genuinely come down there and actually think that this is an active war zone. And I would say she probably does not actually believe that since she did
Well,
come.
is that the one where she was on the roof and 6 people were out in the corner?
Yeah.
I love that.
Fighting back in the kind of most ridiculous way possible by doing a naked bike ride or dressed up in frog costumes. It makes it very difficult for the people who want to set the message that this is a war zone that requires intervention to really get that message across.
We've got 77 million people right now that are being indoctrinated that your mere presence are considered right now by those people as a mass agitation movement.
This is Black Man Spy.
Hi, I'm Malcolm Nance, and this is Black Man Spy. Well, welcome to this week's episode of Black Man Spy, videocast, podcast, which is going out on many different platforms. And I am so glad to be back. I spent the last 10 days in Egypt, where I was carrying out a historic tour that I lead overseas, and it was great. Here's the worst part. It was great to be out of the United States for 10 days where I had limited information about the enormous masses of stupidity that had been going on in my absence. Yes, it's awesome that there has now been a ceasefire where the surviving Israeli hostages have been taken out of Hamas captivity, and now 7 of the remains of people who were killed on October 7, 2024, 2023 actually, have been taken out, and now we have a deal which looks like it could be a peace deal. We'll be doing a future podcast about that. Now, I do want to note that Joe Biden got 140 hostages out of captivity, including every living and deceased female hostage that Hamas terrorist group had captured while storming, Israel on October 7th. That being said, I returned to the United States, and what do I see? There's a video of the Secretary of Homeland Security, a woman whose only claim to fame prior to this was that she shot her puppy to death because she couldn't train it. And that's why she was selected as Secretary of Homeland Security. Kristi Noem made a statement that they have discovered that there is a terrorist group operating out of Portland, Oregon, named, and that is an Antifa or anti-fascist group that is sophisticated, organized, has deep communications, and is more dangerous than the MS-13 gang that actually ran El Salvador for a while, Tren de Aragua not terrorist group, gang that operates out of Venezuela, and Hezbollah. Okay, when I was 21 years old and sent to Beirut, Lebanon in way back in 1983, Hezbollah announced their presence to the world by blowing up the U.S. Marine barracks, killing 243 sailors and Marines, and the French paratroop forces, killing 58, and an Israeli headquarters, killing 21 and 38 captives in there at the same time, and took part, if not planned, organized, and executed, the first American embassy bombing, which killed, if I'm not mistaken, 49 people, including all of the CIA officers that were in Lebanon at that time. That's just 1983. That's a terrorist group. But Kristi Noem said people in Portland who call themselves Antifa are equivalent to Hezbollah, Hamas, right? And Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I have worked against all of those groups in an intelligence capacity at some point in my career, which started in 1983. I wrote a textbook called The Terrorist Recognition Handbook, is used by law enforcement all around the world. It was used by federal law enforcement every year. We're on the 3rd edition of it, which defines pretty clearly what is and what is not terrorism. What is terrorism are people who are carrying out acts of violence or threats of political violence in order to impact an audience beyond the immediate victims, not murder, assassination, not a car accident, a definitive use of a car as a weapon system to kill people in order to make others frightened. There are very clear parameters about what terrorism is. And Kristi Noem has got to be out of her goddamn mind to think that being opposed to fascism is terrorism. You have to actually plan or plot and act, which meets the definition of terrorism. You just can't go around saying that. But then again, the last time this was done has been in every dictatorship ever. Or she is so stupid, and I often use that as a technical intelligence phrase for someone who is ill-informed. She is so stupid that she doesn't care what the Department of Homeland Security and the entire intelligence apparatus of the United States says. She's making things up in her head because the president has told her to make them up in her head. Now the Attorney General has decided to back this attack on sophisticated terrorist groups in their heads. This is crazy. So with that, let me introduce two people who I hope can bring a moment of sanity into your day. They are Courtney Vaughn, the news editor at the Portland Mercury, a magazine and online publication based out of Portland, Oregon, and Taylor Griggs, a news reporter for the Portland Mercury. They are what you call journalists. And way back in the oldie days, journalists would actually investigate claims and accusations and come up with an unbiased take on them. Not only that, they are both residents of what Donald Trump calls a burning hellhole. That is a war zone. I'm not joking. I'm quoting. That is Portland, Oregon. Based on everything I've seen, the most that I could come up with that is acts of terrorism that are being carried out in the city of Portland is a technical definition of terrorism called state terrorism. And that is when a government decides to use either legally through corrupt laws or extrajudicially their secret paramilitary police and paramilitary and military and intelligence apparatus against its own citizens in order to terrify all the rest into compliance. That's the only terrorism I'm seeing. And with that, let's welcome these two excellent journalists to Black Man Spy. Courtney, Vaughn, Taylor Griggs, welcome to this week's episode of Black Man Spy. I know this is unusual because this is a national security platform in which I bring these perspectives about America's threats to the United States and its national security from generally a U.S. intelligence-based position. But as I heard from the Secretary of Homeland Security and the Attorney General of the United States, you both live in a terrorist-filled hellhole, which is no better. I mean, no better than the gangs of MS-13, which ruled El Salvador, and Trinidad, which is a very small group of people in Venezuela, and Hamas, Hezbollah, and Al Qaeda and ISIS. So that brings me to want to talk to the clearly, obviously terrorists who are drinking the lattes that I'm not drinking, and that would be the both of you. Or at least you are the observers of this phenomenon. And I want to use this week's podcast to recalibrate America back to the reality that I'm pretty sure it is. So thanks for coming this week.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us. When you put it that way, it's really striking.
It is striking because I was overseas. I was in Egypt, and I saw this statement by Kristi Noem, the dog killer, who said that, you were that people in the city of Portland who refer to themselves as Antifa are a terrorist organization with more structure, organization, sophistication of Al Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah, Hamas, organizations that I worked against for decades. I was there at the founding of Hezbollah. I was in Lebanon when they were founded and blew up 243 American service members. So I'm not going to entertain the stupidity of that ridiculous comment because that's a professional intelligence term. It's stupid. So what I want to do, since you are both journalists and I am not a journalist, when I was on MSNBC for 7 years, I was a spy that spoke on television. So I had none of the journalistic integrity that other people had that you have. And what I want to give this week is the perspective from the ground on Portland. So, is Voodoo Donuts on fire and is being besieged by horrific liberal forces of Antifa's, communist marching army? And is Powell Books your headquarters, the headquarters of the resistance? Or what's your perspective? Courtney, let's start with you. What's going on in Portland?
Oh, I can confidently say Voodoo Donuts is not on fire. Powell's Books is still standing. Nothing is on fire. In fact, during a lot of the protests here, there was a whole marathon. We had the Portland Marathon. It was a beautiful day. A lot of people ran in that. So life is moving on as usual. And it's important to note that these protests, these awfully dangerous war zone protests, they're really just happening within the vicinity of one city block, as our local police chief pointed out. They're really contained to a very small area. The rest of the city's fine.
We heard that in Los Angeles, right? The Los Angeles riots and that required the National Guard was literally one city block. Taylor, can you tell me specifically where that block is, what's on it that's making people go there to do any form of protest, which I heard was a protected activity under the, what do you call it? The First Amendment of the Constitution, the right to protest and the right to peacefully assemble.
Yeah, so the ICE facility in Portland is located in the South Waterfront, which is near OHSU, the medical school and hospital. It's a pretty chill neighborhood most of the time. Right now, there is kind of increased activity because, people have been protesting the Trump administration's increased immigration crackdown. For most of the summer, there's been very small, relative to some protests we've had in Portland and elsewhere. Recently, they're very small protests, 12, a dozen, 15 or 20 people there most of the time. And they're there often and, they're, I don't know, maybe they're making some noise every once in a while. But the response from the feds has often been to tear gas. And that has caused problems in the surrounding neighborhood because, yeah, it's not really pleasant to all of a sudden have tear gas coming into your apartment. Through the vents and everything. So yeah, but then all of a sudden, when the National Guard, the threat to send National Guard troops and the increased federal police response came, I think the protests have gotten bigger. What they have not gotten is it more violent or scary. And in fact, as people now are seeing in these photos and videos of people in inflatable frog costumes and, all sorts of things like that, they're people are having fun in a sense. And I think, yeah, I don't think that the Kristi Noem could genuinely come down there and actually think that this is an active war zone. And I would say she probably does not actually believe that since she did come to this.
She did come to that facility. Is that the one where she was on the roof and 6 people were out in the corner?
Yeah.
I love that. Okay, look, I'll bounce back and forth between the two of you, and then if you guys have more comments, just raise your finger. Courtney, what is the history? We say in the intelligence community, precedence is predictive. So what is the Trump is clearly watching old video footage of the rioting or not rioting. I wrote a technical manual called the Terrorist Recognition Handbook. This is why I have you both here. It's used throughout all of the United States government, including the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. And one of the things that I have in there is the definition of terrorism, 6 different ways. And then what is not terrorism, right? Civil unrest is not terrorism. If that was the case, Super Bowl parties and tearing down, I'm from Philadelphia, tearing down Center City, Philadelphia, when the Phillies win a pennant or the Eagles won the Super Bowl, would have been, we would have been doing airstrikes on them. Civil disobedience, even to the point of violence, is a criminal act but it's not terrorism, right? But we've got 77 million people right now that are being indoctrinated that your mere presence in the United States, and I say you as the collective population of Portland, Oregon, and the surrounding areas, right, are considered right now by those people as a mass agitation movement. So where did he get this footage? When's the last time there was civil unrest on a scale that that Donald Trump is clearly watching over and over again from Fox News?
Yeah, it's a good question. The theory is that he was probably being shown footage from 2020 when we did have Black Lives Matter protests. They were pretty sustained. I think one could argue they weren't necessarily violent or out of control every day either then. But that's the theory, is that he probably saw some old footage that's circulating around. I'll go ahead and speculate. We know that he also looks at AI videos, so there's no telling where this footage is coming from. But it's certainly not representative of what's happening here. You can go down there today and it's pretty calm. Even at night, when there are more people there, there's nothing that remotely resembles the kind of war zone or sort of like riot scene that they're pushing.
And when you say there, you're talking about that one block street front of the ICE facility.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, how many can somebody? I'll have it look up. We need to figure out how many square blocks there are in Portland, right? So that we can put this into perspective. Because what you have here is clearly, obviously, propaganda and media manipulation, and they want that. Apparently, your city is on fire, and it is a horrible war zone in which now they want to bring National Guard in from everywhere, which is their solution. But we all know what's really happening here, right? A peaceful city has a militarized paramilitary presence in which they are now going extra legally to a certain extent, or have created their own legal framework, and they're snatching citizens off the street, which in every country I ever targeted, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Yemen, South Sudan, Uganda, whatever, this is called the secret police. Completely masked up people who would do these things. So if Portland is not Taylor, do you want to say something about how Portland is or is not the horrific war zone that's being portrayed to the man in the White House?
Well, I'll go back kind of to what you were saying earlier. I mean, about I don't know the exact square blocks, but I have here an op-ed written actually by our chief of police. He says that the city is 145 square miles. It's a big city as far as, the landmass. So yes, this block is a very, very small percentage. And I think it is notable that our local law enforcement has kind of stood up in this situation. The leaders, Chief Bob Day here, wrote this op-ed saying essentially, what they're saying is not true. The war zone is absolutely inaccurate, and it certainly doesn't require National Guard troops sent from Oregon, Texas, California, wherever. All of these things that unprecedented law enforcement crackdown on. Really, if they did come, they have nothing to do in this situation. That it's just not necessary.
Well, when I made the Voodoo Donuts joke a little earlier, it's only because I saw a photograph of 6 guardsmen in their regular, soft cap BDUs without their gear, all holding a dozen Voodoo Donuts and eating them in front of the place. And somebody wrote that the guard deployment is horrific, but it's good for local businesses. But it's ridiculous that we've gotten to the point where, one, I should even be talking to you, and two, where we have to go on air to describe a peaceful city as a peaceful city in which let's call it a half a square block, right? It's probably not the entire block that facility occupies. And, but the violence is being perpetrated by one side. And to me, as an objective intelligence professional, I'm seeing paramilitary police activity here, secret police activity coming out on the street, monitoring from above, the use of the pepper balls, shooting any innocent person. They're not even crossing. They painted a blue line there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether it was Portland or Chicago where the comedian Robbie Roadsteamer was taken into custody. He wasn't across the blue line. This guy dresses as like a giraffe. And not an inflatable one, just a giraffe suit. And he sings all these ridiculous songs. And he had 3 ICE agents come rush out, crossed into the civilian zone, tackled him, dragged him back into the facility. If I'm not mistaken, that happened, was it Portland where the vans of unmarked vans were going in 2020 and were snatching people off the street?
Yeah, you're correct.
Okay, that was then. And that was under if I'm not mistaken, they were Federal Protective Service officers. They were later identified as Federal Protective Services, which if you guys don't know, those are the guys who run X-ray machines at courthouses. Okay, they are not SWAT trained officers. They've been putting them all in there. And so as this emerges that Portland is now being filled with federalized officers, what does the chief of police actually have to say about cooperating with them or even stopping them? In Chicago, they're forming a state plan to arrest masked, armed federal law enforcement officers. What's going on your side?
Well, I can say I want to go back to something you said a second ago about the sort of the masked folks there. I mean, at the facility, we know, as you described, these federal officers, they look like they're highly militarized. They've got ballistic vests on. They look like they're ready for war. And as you can see, the protesters are in inflatable costumes. So there's this huge dichotomy between, what's happening on the federal side and then what the response is from the protesters. And it's important to just note that distinction, that these federal officers, like you mentioned, they're not necessarily trained in de-escalation or crowd management or protest management, as you say. But they, nevertheless, they're attacking sometimes protesters who aren't even trespassing. They're just in the street filming. We know that happened last weekend. And it really is a really excessive use of force for what's actually happening there in the response from protesters. But to go back to your question about the police, the chief of police here has repeatedly said that, they are helping to the degree they can. They've got it under control. Just recently, the mayor wrote to Kristi Noem and other federal officials saying, look, the federal government had asked for them to create free speech zones and to kind of further restrict access to the facility. And they were like, look, we're going to continue to honor the First Amendment. People have a right to protest. They have a right to free speech, and there's nothing, doing that kind of thing would kind of impede on that right. But they've repeatedly said that, they are there, they're helping. You can go there and see there are plenty of Portland police officers there, kind of managing the crowds and, assisting as they can. They are limited. They can't help enforce immigration law, but they certainly are helping to corral the crowds there, if you will. And there's no truth to the statement that National Guard troops are needed from our perspective, because the chief of police has also pointed out that they have access to Oregon State Police. They have access to a plethora of other neighboring police agencies if they needed them. They've never had reason to call them there.
Right. Now, when you say protesters, are we talking where they have to corral them? Are you talking about nude bicycle riders, or are you talking the inflatable dancing dolls? By the way, I'm going to take some credit here. About 10 days ago, I was on Stephanie Miller's radio show, which I don't know if you know, but they have 6 million listeners on Sirius XM radio. And I said that, it was when there was only the one guy who was coming out of the frog. And I said, flood that place with inflatable people. And within a week, I'm a big advocate for the inflatable costumes, huge advocate. I am also a big advocate when they were in Los Angeles for the disco dance party, especially when the Marines were there. I wanted people to play nonstop in the Navy by the Village People, which is the most humiliating thing that could ever happen to a soldier, to a Marine or a soldier. And of course, when they go back to their little barracks rooms, that everyone will be mocking them relentlessly for their mere presence and having to be around in the Navy. So these are the sort of psychological operations tools I'm also a big fan of. Oh, glitter and snowblowers. Big fan. So because one, you can't control the winds, right? But two, you can also tell who's been where when they come out in glitter, right? So, as somebody said, the herpes of the arts and crafts world. Oh, Taylor, let me. Okay, sorry, that was my greatest hits on subversive operations. Let's go to the heart of the matter, and Taylor, I'll start with you because I'm so sorry we're having this conversation. Usually I'm crying because it's other terrible things that are happening in Donald Trump's regime. Now this is just crying because this is so silly that Portland's biggest problem is whether they're going to be able to keep up with the donut sales of all the cops and federal officers and military that would come into the city. So Taylor, let's go to the really important question. I know terrorism. I've fought terrorists, studied terrorists, was on air for 7 years as the terrorist analyst at MSNBC, wrote 10 books, 5 New York Times bestsellers. One of them was an encyclopedia of ISIS, right? Defeating ISIS. Having a hard time recognizing the anarchist groups, which ever since I've been watching, since the George Floyd era, Portland has always had this sliver of, anti-government, libertarian, or anarchist groups who I'm specifically speaking about Black Bloc, right? The Black Bloc anarchists who always come to every protest everywhere. It could be for, puppy mills, and those guys will come out to it and break windows. They're very famous. When I lived in DC 25 years ago for the G7 or any, World Bank meetings, these guys would come down into DC all dressed in black, ball peen hammers, backpack full of rocks, and carry out anarchy. Is the White House sort of mistaking Black Bloc anarchists for what they think is a highly organized terrorist group? I'm even sorry I have to ask the question, but I'm interested in your answer.
Yeah, I mean, I am not an expert in terrorist organizations, and because I'm, as you've been saying, we're local reporters in Portland. This isn't something we kind of thought we'd have to be experts in. But I will say, as someone who's covered the local kind of left-wing ecosystem, I guess I'll say, and I would first of all say that people, who identify as kind of Black Bloc anarchists, it's a small group of people who are not organized necessarily all together. Not, some may be inclined, I guess, to throw stuff at windows every once in a while, but that's really not what we've been seeing in this situation down at the ICE facility. And it's just important to say, like, the fact that the Trump administration has been saying that, these left-wing Antifa groups, which really, it's worth pointing out over and over again that this is not an organized, group of people all with a necessarily a common goal, or, a set of rules and strictures, because there's a lot of infighting. I mean, when you go down there, people are on very different frames of mind of whether or not you can take photos, of whether, like, it's not, they're not being violent with each other, but it's very clear people have very different ideas. It's laughable to suggest that this is some kind of highly regulated and coordinated terrorist organization, because they don't always agree with each other on very minor things. Yeah, but
go ahead.
Well, I mean, I do think it's they've done a good job in this situation with coming out in these costumes and just showing how ridiculous it is, because I understand the maybe the motivation to be very angry in this moment. There's so much injustice happening and it feels like there's really nothing you can do about it. But I would say that the fighting back in the kind of most ridiculous way possible by doing a naked bike ride or dressed up in frog costumes, it makes it very difficult for the people who want to set the message that this is a war zone that requires this kind of intervention to really get that message across. And I think it'll be interesting to see if it resonates with anybody. I mean, really, you have to be completely lying and portraying very, I don't know what you'd have to show in order to convince people that this is necessary, given.
Well, considering the administration is engaged in propaganda, they are lying and showing entirely old footage. So, as you said, you would have to do that in order to craft this meta narrative around the city of Portland, Oregon, that it is a flaming liberal hellhole filled of organized terrorists. I see this all the time now on right-wing media. I monitor the right-wing media, so you don't have to. Because I wrote, my last book was called They Want to Kill Americans, the malicious terrorist and deranged ideology of the Trump insurgency. They're organized. I mean, they have organizations, they have gun clubs, they have boatloads of weapons, they have an ideology they're surrounding around. And we've seen dozens of actual attacks which constitute terrorism, which, of course, by the way, for the benefit of the audience, for all of you who are listening, terrorism is an act of violence or threat of violence in which is perpetrated against a specific location, whether it's government or individual or civilian population, which is political in nature, in order to impact an audience greater than the immediate victim. So murder isn't terrorism unless it is an assassination, which is political murder. Demonstration is not terrorism at any time. It can't be. Even the American Nazis of the American Bund in 1939 that protested and rented Madison Square Garden and put George Washington next to, 25-foot high George Washington's next to 25-foot high Adolf Hitler's. Not terrorism, right? You have to actually carry out or plan or prepare a specific act. I see this all the time. Oh, the liberal left. The Weathermen of the 1960s were a domestic terrorist group. Unfortunately, we have no domestic terrorist laws in this country. Timothy McVeigh was, without a doubt, the single most devastating American terrorist in our history. 186 people were killed in his truck bomb attack. He was never charged with terrorism because there's no laws on the books. He was charged with using a weapon of mass destruction and conspiracy to commit murder. And they had to choose one FBI officer who was killed as the person that he conspired to commit murder, even though he literally walked through a child care center 2 times while doing reconnaissance and parked the truck in front of the child care center. That's how terrorism works. You actually have to want to do something which fits not Malcolm Nance definition of terrorism, which fits the terrorist tactics, techniques, and methodologies, right? So something as simple as arson. So if you set fire to a movie theater while there are children in it, famous case in Iran in 1978, killed 250 children, it was arson, which is a basic crime. But the goal was not to impress on the children that they were going to burn to death. It was to topple the government by destabilizing it. So by eating freaking donuts and doing a inflatable unicorn disco dance party to Boogie Wonderland does not constitute terrorism. And I'm sorry I have to clear that up, but the people who are listening to this, my biggest problem for both, I'm going to get back to both of you. My biggest problem is that we want to debate it. I'm here to not debate it. I just wanted to hear, what it was like to live in a bicycle-ridden, donut-filled, latte obsessed hellhole that is Portland. And full disclosure, I haven't been to Portland since 1981. But this administration is focused around one piece of evidence. I'm going to tell you what that is if you already haven't heard. And I'm sure you should do a full spread summary of this across 6 days in your newspapers for your Pulitzer. They point to the East Rose City Antifa, right? There was one group that called themselves East Rose City Antifa, had a Facebook page or a web page, and to them, that is a massive terrorist-fueled organization. Does the groups there that refer to themselves as Antifa and who use that symbology from the 1932, Spanish, the Spanish Civil War, the Black Flag, Red Flag, are they just 4 people at a Starbucks meeting every morning, or are these the more like the anarchists? Right? They get together when there's a protest, and one guy goes, "Come on, let's go smash some windows." who are these people that the president is pointing to as Antifa? And I don't mean the generic Antifa. They seem to think that this specific group even has a boyfriend. So, Courtney, what do you think?
No, yeah, I think
I'm laughing. For the podcast listeners, I'm trying not to cry. My head is in my hands. Go on.
we're in dangerous territory, right? I
I'll
do
say.
think they are looking at the protesters, specifically those who've been at the ICE facility, and saying, "Oh, they're all part of this terrorist organization," which is a really dangerous thing to say. They know what they're doing, because if you can paint someone as a terrorist, that opens up a lot of floodgates in terms of legal power, which is really dangerous. But yeah, we don't know of any highly organized, certainly not highly funded group of people who is getting together to do any sort of organizing around protesting or anarchist acts. It's just not accurate. I mean, you'll have a lot of people around Portland who will say, well, if we're talking about Antifa and just anti-fascism, that's like almost the whole city, right? I mean, a lot of people are saying, I'm anti-fascist. My grandpa was anti-fascist. My mom was anti-fascist. Let's be real. Nobody wants a resurgence of fascism. So it is a little bit wild to hear federal officials say, well, there's a group, this Antifa group is just a highly organized terrorist group, because now you're labeling a group which we know is decentralized, not organized. It's not even a cohesive group. I mean, there may be a few friends who get together and say, hey, let's go down there and protest together for safety. That's probably the full extent of it in my experience. But I think, yeah, it's a manipulative tool to be able to unleash the full extent of the law against people who all they want to do is protest, make their voices heard, and really just fight back against, like you said, this regime. I mean, it's turned into a regime. It's very authoritarian the way they're handling the protesters, and it's scary. And I think people are, I think it's logical and natural that people would want to try to resist that.
Well, in our American Revolution history, I'm from Philadelphia, so I'm a real Yankee originalist on the American Revolution. The Boston Tea Party was actually an act of vandalism and technically an act of terrorism. The purpose of it was to destabilize not the individual ship in the tea that was thrown in the water, but to send a message back to Parliament in England and the East India Tea Company that the Americas was not having it. That ekes under the line just of not being terrorism. But tar and feathering governors, tar and feathering tax collectors. When you got tarred and feathered, you died from that, right? You third-degree burns of tar all over your body. So the Sons of Liberty, which John Adams' cousin Samuel Adams formed, by all definitions met the meaning of a terrorist group. I am not seeing an act there in Portland at all whatsoever that could constitute terrorism, or even the plot of terrorism, or planning for terrorism. Taylor, help me here. What are these morons talking about? By the way, another technical intelligence term for people who cannot do proper analysis.
Yeah, I mean, Portland, as you've said, has a history of kind of, I would say, left-wing protests and activism. There is a group, or was, I mean, it's still technically active, I guess, called Rose City Antifa. Really, they were formed as an opposition to neo-Nazi groups and groups like the Proud Boys. Right now, as far as I can tell, this group is not active. I mean, I may be wrong, because I think people, don't necessarily, they're not super public with this, but if it is, it's very small. They were kind of around, there were people identifying, I guess, as members of Rose City Antifa in 2020 and 2021, and they were most active doing counter demonstrations to groups like, right-wing groups like the Proud Boys, who, I should say, have, people identifying with right-wing groups have killed people in Portland and other places. So I think that's kind of how they saw themselves, as sort of a, counter group to some dangerous forces coming in from outside the city, pretty much. Right now, they're at the ICE facility. I mean, there's a lot of things going on. I guess they're trying to say that all of this has to do with each other, or there's I think that there are issues in Portland, I guess, that people have pointed to. I mean, We have homeless people in the city, which is the case in cities everywhere, and a result of, I think, disinvestment in people who and getting them into housing. This has nothing to do with the protests or anything like that, but you can show any scene that you want of something that is disfavorable to people and say that this is indication that this is a whole hellhole of a place. They have no idea of what they would actually do to solve any of these problems, and I don't think they want to do that. They just kind of want to sow misinformation about this, I think, Democrat-run city or something. Portland doesn't like Trump, so I think that he's coming after us for that reason.
Yeah. Well,
I think I've said a lot of things, but it's all crazy. I mean, really.
well, it's crazy, and I feel sorry that you actually have to report on any of this. All of you should be talking about the dog catcher race, and how many bandanas or the popular styles of bandanas on your puppies this year. That's and which latte flavor is now favored the most. This is what I think of when I think of Portland. I do not think of anything that has anything to do with my world. And now that that a third of the electorate in the United States has been manipulated to believing that your city is this on fire hellhole, I have no earthly idea why the city of Portland, here's some little hints you can drop. The city of Portland should have live feed camera, right, of the streets of Portland, the obvious hellhole with working mass transit and people who want to live there in a beautiful land space, as opposed to that one block. And one other recommendation I would ask for you to ask the chief of police, explain to you why they don't put up barriers that are protected by the police facing the ICE facility so that the police can protect the population as opposed to becoming, facing inwards towards the crowd and becoming a de facto barrier for ICE. Technically, they're supposed to protect and uphold the law. Right now, all the violence, including shooting people from roofs off-site, right, if I'm not mistaken, is coming from the ICE facility. And, perhaps if your police department, I don't know whether they're doing it or not. I haven't seen any evidence of it. If you could have a lineup, use bike cops. That'll piss them off even more, right? Bike cops lining their bikes end to end, 10 of them acting as a barrier facing the ICE facility. That way, no one off-site gets shot, right? No one off-site can instigate violence, and no one can come through the line of police officers to snatch civilians off the side of the road just because they don't like their protected speech. I said this all the time. I ran into a neo-Nazi guy who was prominent in Charlottesville on January 6th, almost lost his eye in Charlottesville from bear mace. And I said to him, I spent my entire life protecting every stupid thing that comes out of your mouth. Every minute, right? You say all the dumbass things that you want. However, once you cross that line into action, that's when the Joint Terrorism Task Forces are going to start coming after you. What I understand from the secretary there, and I'll ask this to you, Taylor, Secretary Noem has now activated all the National Joint Terrorism Task Force to use all the resources of the United States government on your city. And let me tell you, the JTTF is joint. It means FBI, DHS, U.S. Marshals. They can bring in any civilian organization. They could go to they could go to any other city and bring in officers on that. And they theoretically can't violate your rights. Just be advised, if there are any small aircraft constantly orbiting over the center of your city, those are signal intelligence flights that are going after cell phones with a system called Stinger. And they could be listening to your phone or her phone or the mayor's phone in order to gain evidence for this fantasy that they have in their head that there is a major activity going. Oh, they also used not YouTube. They were using their Predator drones that belong to Customs and Border. Instead of running them on the border, they were using them over downtown Los Angeles. 12 hours on, 12 hours off. So, there are resources and activities that you may not know about, including undercover U.S. Army personnel who have been tasked out to the, from Joint Special Operations Command, who are coming under the joint authority of the Department of Homeland Security, but you can see them, right? Walking rugby teams. And they all look like the same federal officer, and they all buy the same flannel shirt from this tactical equipment company that sells tactical flannel shirts, right? And Carhartt, right? They love that stuff. So my point to my last question, I'll let you guys go. Since you have convinced me that you do not live in a flaming war zone equal to the Second Battle of Fallujah, in which law enforcement is under siege down there. But my last question to you is this. Should this turn into a larger event? Should the National Guard from Texas, if I'm not mistaken, and some other states may be deployed there and come onto the streets, how do you think the city's going to take it? Are we going to have George Floyd Summer #2, which, by the way, is not an act of terrorism?
So there's a lot there. I would say that,
Yeah.
The city has been attempting to curb ISIS influence in various ways. It's possible that one of the reasons that this kind of crackdown started is because the city council and the mayor's office initiated the process of potentially revoking their land use permit at the site because they have proven to violate it in several instances of keeping detainees in the holding facility for longer than the city's code allows them to. People have been calling for them to do that, and kind of this is a long, very bureaucratic procedure, but they are attempting to try to stop them in that way. And I think that, by having the city's police chief, for example, speak out against it like this, I think it's interesting to think of what the city or the police really could do in this situation. I think that if the city's police really started to, as you were suggesting, get involved in that capacity and stand in front of the protesters like that, that seems that's like.
Wait, you mean protect the public?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of people have called on them to do that. It strikes me as, trying to arrest the ICE officers or something, which some people have also suggested because their activity may be illegal, or but it is just really unprecedented situation of having the local law enforcement kind of fight the federal law enforcement in this way. And the federal law enforcement and laws, I think, they're trying to argue triumph in this situation, but that, may or may not be the case in every situation. So I see, more chaos happening, not necessarily at all because of what the protesters are doing, but because as more, harm is inflicted by the federal law enforcement and whoever comes down, and I'm saying federal law enforcement pretty generally, meaning kind of National Guard or ICE agents, CHS, everyone like that, because they're all kind of working toward the same goal, it seems like, in this way. I do think the response is going to get more intense, which will potentially, work to serve the federal government's interest of making this seem like it's a crazy war. So
I think back to what Leah just said, I just want to reiterate. Because she touched on something I think is really important here that we know because we saw it in 2020 when federal agents came in to try to police those protests. All it does is inflame people. And we, the attorneys for Oregon have said that, local police will say that, anybody who lived here in 2020 will say that the more federal law enforcement you bring in, the reason that we saw protests get bigger recently in the first place is because there was that threat of deploying the National Guard. That's what really stirs people up. It instigates, it escalates things. And so there is definitely concern that deploying the National Guard or deploying more federal agents will only piss people off more and just sort of kind of cause more people to fight back against that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that what you're doing in Portland by fighting back through the very effective tools of mockery, of making protests fun again, and not escalating and allowing them to, these guys are cosplaying and fantasizing that they were in the military or special forces. They're wearing all of their kit. that we had overseas, and they weren't qualified to be in those organizations. Many of them weren't. Many are now January 6th people who were pardoned, who are now federal law enforcement officers in an organization that, by all intents and purposes, now is equal to a Geheimstaatspolizei, which is the German for state secret police, which the acronym for that was Gestapo. And I don't use that ironically, I use it professionally. I've seen that in Libya, I've seen it in Iraq, where they'll just run you, used under Saddam's Iraq, they just snatch you off the street extra legally. And in many circumstances, you'd be tortured and killed. We have no idea what's going on there. But they're enjoying that game. So perhaps if the city of Portland wanted to create a de-escalation bubble, they could deploy law enforcement in between ICE and the protesters, but with their faces towards ICE, or escort them on their little raids with police cars, with their lights and sirens going, which is what they don't want. But if you're notifying the community that, a state secret police organization is now active on these streets, and for your protection, we are going to have two cars, one in front of them and one on the rear, right? So that there's deconfliction. They don't want your lights. They don't want your sirens. They want to go out and arrest people extra legally. And between you, me, and the fence posts, this will be the last I'll say about this, because I'm very upset about this circumstance. I personally hope that every one of those guys will be publicly identified in a future administration, and they will cross-correlate their activities, and that they don't have qualified immunity. And I hope that there's a million Better Call Sauls waiting around to exercise the right to redress against officers who have gone out of control, or at least as we see it. Let's give them an opportunity to have the due process that they're not affording to anybody else. And I'm sorry that the citizens of Portland are going through this. I hope it doesn't get violent. If the National Guard deploys in any strength, I will be up there with a group called Remember Your Oath. We were in Washington. I got this group to play at the National Guard tour on the National Guard members at Union Station nonstop. General Milley's "We don't take an oath to a king" speech, and it really got to the soldiers to have that nonstop for 12 hours in their ear to remind them, you are not here to attack U.S. citizens. You're here because a moron has put you here. And I'm sorry to say that Portland is about to get that treatment, but let's hope it doesn't escalate, and that your citizens' exposure of this, you as journalists going out there and telling the truth to the rest of the world, is the panacea that we need, and hope that this does not go to the violence I suspect Stephen Miller wants it to go. By the way, I'm on a podcast every week with Lev Parnas and Michael Cohen. These guys work for Donald Trump. It's called Unleashed. I call it Two Felons and a Spy. And I asked this question. I'm doing a Substack on it today. I asked, who is the person in the administration, based on everyone you met, who's going to push Donald Trump to have people killed in the street? And they universally said Stephen Miller. And Stephen Miller is the person who claims he made the decision about what's going on in the deployment to Chicago and to Portland. So, take it from there, journalist. But thank you guys for being here, and thank you for giving me your perspectives. I am now going to make sure America knows that there is that the reality on the ground is what we all suspect, is that you guys are all out jogging and rollerblading or whatever fun things you do up there, and eating donuts and going to big bookstores, which is my favorite pastime, and having coffee. All right. So thank you both very much, Courtney, Vaughn, Taylor, Griggs. I really appreciate your perspective on this week's episode of Black Man Spy. If anything goes out of control, I'm going to call you back.
Okay.
Thanks for having us.
All right. Bye-bye. Excellent discussion and reportage by Courtney Vaughn and Taylor Griggs coming from Portland. It turns out that Black Man Spy has acquired a piece of intelligence, visual intelligence, in which we have found the evidence, in which the Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, has seen the burning hellhole and war zone that is Portland. And we're going to play that video for you as we exit this week's episode of Black Man Spy. Hey, stay tuned in next week. We're going to have another great guest talking about the crisis that has gripped America. And we're also going to talk about the No Kings protest that is taking place on October 18th here in the United States, in which we reaffirm our commitment that this nation was founded upon, by, and for the people, and not for a king, no matter how fat and orange he actually is. So stay tuned for next week's episode of Black Man Spy. Go find my latest piece on how Stephen Miller is the person who is going to cause Americans to be killed on Substack this week. The Man Who Wants You Dead is what it's called. And with that, take care. We'll see you next week. I love saying it. I will see you on the beach.
Look at Portland, and you see fires all over the place. You see fights and, just violence.
This network of Antifa is just as sophisticated as MS-13, as TDA, as ISIS, as Hezbollah, as Hamas, as all of them. They are just as dangerous. They have an agenda to destroy us, just like the other terrorists we've dealt with for many, many years.
When ICE officers have to street battle against Antifa, hand-to-hand combat every night to come and go from their building.
Slide to the left.